The stars did not shine the night they dragged him in chains across the obsidian floor of the Velkara throne room. They never shone here, not because there were no stars, but because the Velkara had built their palace beneath a sky of living stone, a ceiling carved from the dark mineral they called vein, a material so dense it absorbed all light and returned nothing. That was, as he would come to understand, the first lesson about this civilization. They did not believe in returning what they took. His name was Darian Cole, 31 years old, former Xenobiological Survey Officer for the United Earth Exploration Corps. He had spent 6 years cataloging alien ecosystems across 43 star systems, learning 17 partial alien languages, and writing reports that nobody on Earth would read for another 2 decades. He was not a soldier. He was not a hero. He was a scientist with calloused hands and a scar above his left eyebrow from the time a Zephyrian sandcrawler had knocked him sideways into a rock formation on Kepler 442b. He had survived that. He had survived a hull breach on the UEEC Meridian. He had survived a parasitic infection on Gliese 667cc that the ship's medic had given him a 40% chance of living through. But he had never survived something like this. They had taken him 14 days ago, or what he estimated to be 14 days, counting sleep cycles in the dark. His ship, the Vanguard Sparrow, a small 2-person survey vessel, had been pulled from orbit around the Velkara homeworld of Soveth Prime by a gravitational tether array so advanced that his ship's entire electronic system had simply gone dark. No alarm. No warning. One moment he was adjusting the atmospheric scanner above the planet's northern pole, and the next, silence. Absolute, total silence, and then the hiss of something boarding. He had not even had time to send a distress signal. There was a fundamental principle in xenobiology, one of the oldest in the field, that contact protocols existed for a reason. Civilizations were not inherently hostile. Most species, when approached correctly, responded to the universals: mathematics, light patterns, cautious withdrawal of weapons. The protocols had worked on 31 of the 43 worlds Darian had visited. The other 12 had been uninhabited or populated by organisms too primitive for communication. The Velkara, he now understood, were Category 0, a classification that existed theoretically in UEEC documentation but had never been formally applied. Category 0 meant technologically advanced, culturally sovereign, and entirely uninterested in protocol. He had tried to speak to them in the ship. They had ignored him. He had tried hand signals. They had bound his hands. He had tried to demonstrate mathematical knowledge by tapping prime numbers on the wall of his holding cell. A guard had entered and struck him hard enough across the jaw to split his lip, then left without a word. Language was power. He had known that since his first semester of xenolinguistics at the academy. When you stripped a person or a being of the ability to communicate, you stripped them of personhood itself. The Velkara understood this perfectly. They had been doing it for centuries. Soveth Prime, he had managed to learn from what little he could observe, was a world of extreme atmospheric pressure, roughly 1.4 times Earth's at sea level, and a gravitational field that sat at 1.1 g, just enough to make every step slightly heavier than it should be. The Velkara themselves were bipedal, averaging between 7 and 8 feet in height, with exoskeletons of pale silver blue that shifted slightly in color depending on their emotional state. A phenomenon called chromatophoric biosignaling in earth science, common in cephalopods like octopuses, but extraordinarily rare in bipedal land-dwelling species. Their faces were angular and elongated, with 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal line, 2 forward-facing for depth perception, 2 lateral for peripheral awareness, which meant they had nearly 280 degrees of natural vision. Their hands had 6 fingers, each with 2 additional joints compared to a human hand, granting them a dexterity that made human fine motor skills look clumsy by comparison. They were, objectively, a marvel of biology. They were also, by every cultural metric Darian could observe, a species built entirely around hierarchy, dominance, and the concept of vel, a word he had parsed from repeated context, which seemed to mean something between rightful supremacy and natural order. Everything in their society flowed from vel. The queen was the highest expression of vel. Her court existed to enforce it. The soldiers existed to extend it. And those who were captured, taken, stripped of autonomy, they were called sheftel, a term that with agonizing slowness Darian had begun to decode. It meant something close to those without vel. The powerless, the property. He had begun learning their language the moment he was thrown into the holding cell. Not because anyone taught him, not because he had a translation device, his had been confiscated along with everything else. He learned by listening, by watching the guards interact, parsing the tonal structures, identifying which syllables carried emotional weight, which were neutral connectors, which seemed to function as verbs versus nouns. He had done this before partial field decoding of unknown languages, but never under these conditions. Never hungry, never in pain, never with the knowledge that every mistake could cost him in ways he could not predict. But the human brain, he reminded himself, was the most aggressive pattern recognition engine ever produced by biological evolution. 300,000 years of survival instinct didn't switch off because circumstances were dire. If anything, it sharpened. By the 4th day, he had 30 words. By the 9th, over 100. By the 14th, the day they dragged him before the queen, he had roughly 340 Velkara words and a partial understanding of their grammatical structure. Not enough to hold a conversation, enough to understand one. The throne room was immense. The floor was polished black stone, and his boots, they had at least left him his boots, made soft sounds against it that the room's acoustics stretched into something almost musical. On either side, Velkara courtiers stood in formation, their exoskeletons shimmering between silver and a cold violet that he now associated with contempt. The air was thick with something, a mineral scent, almost metallic, like the air before a lightning strike. His wrists were bound in a material that was warm to the touch and seemed to tighten slightly whenever he tensed his muscles. Bioreactive restraints. Clever. And then he saw her. Queen Savara Velketh sat on a throne that was not decorative. It was functional, a command structure, integrated with what appeared to be environmental and communication systems, glowing panels embedded in the armrests, cables running from the base into the floor like roots. She was taller than most of her court, easily 8 feet, and her exoskeleton was a deep, shifting indigo, a color he had not yet seen on any Velkara, which suggested it was either a biological marker of royalty or a deliberate cosmetic choice. Her 4 eyes fixed on him with an attention that felt almost scientific. She was studying him the same way he had spent years studying alien species. He stood straighter without meaning to. She spoke. Her voice was resonant, layered. The Velkara seemed to produce 2 simultaneous tones when they spoke, a primary pitch-carrying meaning and a secondary harmonic-carrying emphasis. She said something to her court first, and the courtiers responded with a short, synchronized sound that he now understood to be a form of formal acknowledgement. Then she looked directly at him and spoke again. Slower this time. Deliberate. He caught 5 words. Sheftel, Veller, Keth, Mavar, Soveth. Slave, belonging, throne, brought before, home world. She was telling her court and him what he was, what he had been designated. The word Sheftel was not an insult in their culture. It was a category, a legal classification. She was not mocking him with it. She was simply stating a fact in the way one might state that an object is a tool. That, he thought, was actually worse. He did not speak, not yet, because he understood, from everything he had observed, from the behavioral patterns of the guards, from the way the court responded to the queen's slightest tonal shift, that speaking out of turn in this space would not be interpreted as communication. It would be interpreted as aggression. And he was bound, outnumbered on an alien world, in a palace he hadn't mapped, without a ship, without a weapon, without anyone who knew where he was. He was, by every practical measure, the least powerful being in this room. So he listened. The queen spoke for several minutes, a formal address of some kind, her secondary harmonic rising and falling with rhythmic precision. Court business. He caught fragments. Something about a territory called Velmuth, a region, he thought, a contested one. Something about a species called the Orath, which the court's chromatophores shifted red at the mention of red, he had learned, was agitation or threat response. The Orath were clearly a problem. There was a concept being discussed, repeated several times. Shevtilin vor Keth, he parsed it as the slave-taken resource or possibly the obtained asset. Him, most likely, or what they intended to do with him. He was either going to be used for labor, used for study, or used as a political gesture of some kind. Given that a queen was personally presiding over the introduction, he was leaning toward the third option. Someone had decided. He was valuable enough to present at court. That was the first thread he had to pull. When the formal address ended, the queen looked at him again. Her lateral eyes moved slightly. He noticed this now, a subtle physical tell he hadn't documented yet. The lateral eyes moved when she was processing something beyond the obvious, when her attention went deeper. She was not just looking at him, she was considering him. She said one word directly to him, a command, tonal structure of directive. He had heard it used by guards when they wanted prisoners to perform an action. Veller. Speak. He had two choices in this moment, and he felt them both with absolute clarity. He could pretend he didn't understand, maintain the appearance of total ignorance, buy time, observe more. Or he could respond, partially, imperfectly. Let them know that the creature they had classified as Sheftel had, in 14 days of a cold cell and deliberate silence, been doing what humans do in any environment, under any pressure, in any cage they are placed in. Learning. He chose the second option. Veller Keth, Mavar. His accent was imperfect. His tonal harmonics were wrong, humans could produce dual tones only poorly, with effort, and his secondary harmonic was weak and slightly off-pitch. But the words were correct. Speak, throne, brought before, roughly. I speak, I was brought before the throne. The silence that followed was absolute. It lasted only 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, the color of every chromatophore in the room shifted simultaneously, from the cool violet of contempt to something he hadn't catalogued yet. A pale green, faintly luminescent. It spread through the court like a wave moving outward from a stone dropped in still water, starting with the courtiers nearest him and moving to the edges of the room. He would later understand that pale green was their version of shock. The queen's 4 eyes had all fixed on him now. The lateral ones had gone still. He had her full, undivided, entirely unprecedented attention. She leaned forward slightly on her throne, just slightly, just enough, and spoke again. Measured. 3 words this time with a rising harmonic he now associated with genuine inquiry rather than rhetoric. Veller, Kethnar, Tova. Speak, throne language, how? How do you speak the throne language? And here was the moment that mattered. Not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't say. He didn't say, because I'm smart. He didn't say, because humans are exceptional. He didn't say anything that a threatened or prideful creature would say. He said the truest thing he could construct from his limited vocabulary, and he said it carefully, deliberately, with the secondary harmonic as steady as he could make it. Kethnar vor Shevtel, Veller Mavar Tova. The throne language belongs to the powerless. Speak, brought before, how, or more freely, the language of the throne belongs to those who are brought before it. That is how. There was another silence, shorter this time. Then, for the first time since he had been taken, the queen smiled. He recognized it not because it looked like a human smile. It didn't, not exactly, but because the biological markers of pleasure response were conserved across species more often than not. The slight relaxation of the periorbital muscles around the upper eye pair. The minute shift in stance from forward dominant to settled. The secondary harmonic, when she finally spoke again, had a warmth in it that had not been there before. She did not treat him like a person, not yet, but she treated him like a puzzle she had not expected to find interesting. That, for now, was enough. In the weeks that followed, Darian's existence changed, not dramatically, not kindly, but perceptibly. He was moved from the holding cell to a smaller chamber near the palace's eastern section. Still locked, still guarded, but with a window, a narrow one, filtered through a translucent material that distorted the outside light into something amber and diffuse, but a window nonetheless. He could see the sky of Soveth Prime for the first time. A deep teal, almost the color of Earth's deepest ocean, crossed every few hours by formations of something between cloud and organism. vast, slow-moving aerial creatures that the Velkara called Vethner, which he translated loosely as skywalkers. They were not birds. They were not fish. They were something that had evolved in an atmosphere 30% denser than Earth's and learned to use the pressure differentials between atmospheric layers as a kind of perpetual locomotion. He watched them for hours. He took notes on the inside of his left forearm with a fragment of dark stone he'd pried from the wall, not deep enough to scar, just enough to mark. A scientist, even in chains, cannot stop being a scientist. He was given food twice daily, solid, dense, dark-colored blocks of comp. Rest nutrition that tasted of absolutely nothing, but provided, presumably, the necessary caloric intake for a human-sized organism. The Velkara had clearly done some biological analysis of him. That, too, was information. They were methodical. They didn't waste resources. He was being kept functional, which meant he was being kept useful. He was also, intermittently, being tested. The first test came 3 days after his throne room introduction. A guard arrived with a flat panel, the Velkara equivalent of a tablet, smooth and dark, responsive to pressure, and left it on the floor of his chamber without explanation. On its surface were symbols. He spent the rest of the day analyzing them, mapping their structure, comparing them to the spoken language he had been decoding. Written Velkara used a logographic system. Each symbol represented a concept rather than a sound, but the concepts were organized with an underlying phonetic skeleton, which meant it wasn't purely logographic, it was a hybrid, like Japanese kanji layered over a syllabic system. Humans had developed similar writing systems independently multiple times throughout history. Chinese characters, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, Sumerian cuneiform, and the cognitive science behind why this happened was well documented. When civilizations needed to record information efficiently across large power distances, rulers, priests, merchants, they developed visual systems that could be learned selectively, with complexity reserved for the powerful and simplified versions available to the rest. He mapped 80 symbols on his arm by nightfall. He left the tablet by the door when the guard came to retrieve it. 2 days later, a more complex panel arrived. He decoded it faster. He did not do this to impress them. He did it because it was the only tool he had, the only resource available to him in a cell with no equipment, no allies, and no clear path to survival beyond relevance. If he was useful, he lived. If he became interesting, he was treated with something approaching care. If he remained merely Sheftel, a powerless thing. Eventually, his utility would be assessed and found wanting, and he had no illusions about what happened to captured UEEC survey officers found wanting by civilizations that classified them as property. He kept learning. He kept noting. He kept, in the private architecture of his own mind, building a picture of Velkara society from every fragment available to him. And he discovered things that troubled him in ways that went beyond his personal danger. The Velkara were not simply a hierarchical species. Hierarchy was their cosmology. They had, as best he could reconstruct from the fragments of written material he was given, and the conversations he could now partially follow, built their entire civilization on the premise that the universe itself had a natural supremacy, and that the highest purpose of any intelligent being was to either express that supremacy or serve it. Their religion was not spiritual in any way he recognized. It was organizational. The divine, in their worldview, was the perfectly ordered system. The sacred was the efficient hierarchy. Every Velkara individual knew their rank to 3 decimal points of precision, ranked against every other member of society through a continuous, lifelong assessment process that began at birth. They had, in essence, built a civilization around the idea that being superior was not just desirable but morally necessary. And yet there were things that didn't fit, small things at first. He noticed that the guard who brought his food, a younger Velkara, low-ranked from the color of his exoskeleton and the deference of his movement, always placed the food block precisely in the center of the floor. Not near the door, not at random. The center, every time. Once, when the food block tipped sideways as he set it down, the guard spent several seconds carefully righting it before leaving. Darian watched this through narrowed eyes and filed it away. He noticed that one of the Queen's senior advisors, a tall, silver exoskeletoned Velcara who attended the twice-weekly formal court sessions, he was now occasionally brought to observe, sometimes paused before giving his reports. A fractional pause, barely perceptible. But Darian had learned to watch for micro-behaviors, the kind that slipped under the official surface of culture and told you about the actual one beneath. The advisor paused before speaking uncomfortable truths. He noticed that when the aerial creatures, the Vethner, passed over the palace, some of the guards looked up. They weren't supposed to. Their eyes were meant to remain forward, fixed in prescribed attention posture. But sometimes, just for a moment, a guard would let their lateral eyes drift upward toward the amber-filtered ceiling, toward the shadow of something vast and free passing overhead. These were not the behaviors of a species that had fully and contentedly accepted its own cosmology. These were the behaviors of a species in tension. He was brought before the Queen again 6 weeks after his arrival. This time, he was not bound. His wrists were bare and his posture was his own. He stood in the center of the throne room, and the court was arrayed in the same formation as before, but the chromatophores held their violet of contempt with less certainty this time. Some had already shifted slightly, watching him with the pale green of interest. The Queen looked the same, indigo and still and measuring. She spoke directly to him, without the formal court address. A conversational register which the secondary harmonics made clear, flatter, closer, less performed. She said something complex, and he caught perhaps 70% of it, enough to understand the structure. She was asking him a question about origin, not where he was from in a navigational sense, but what his people believed. Their vel, their organizing principle. He thought about this for a long moment. Humans, he began in Velcara, his grammar still imperfect but his vocabulary now substantial, do not have one vel. He paused, choosing words carefully. We have argued for our entire history about what the highest order is. We have fought wars over the answer. We have built cities around different answers. We have also, another pause longer, destroyed cities around different answers. The court's chromatophores shifted. Not uniform this time. Some toward green, some toward a color he hadn't fully mapped yet, a warm amber, close to the light that came through his chamber window. The Queen's lateral eyes moved. She said, "And you have not resolved this?" He said, "No, and I think that might be why we are still here." She tilted her head, a motion he had not seen any Velcara make before, and which he suspected was something she had learned from watching him, because he did it when he was processing something unexpected. She said, "Explain." He took a breath. The air of Soveth Prime was slightly heavier in the lungs than Earth's, and after 6 weeks he still felt it, a constant, subtle fullness, like breathing at a slightly too high altitude but inverted, too much rather than too little. He had adapted. He adapted. That was, he realized, exactly what he was about to explain. A species that resolves its hierarchy permanently, he said, slowly and carefully, has finished adapting. It has decided the world is as it is and will be as it is, and the order of things is correct and complete. And perhaps that is. He searched for the right Velcara word. Comfortable, but the universe does not stay as it is. The universe changes. And the species that argues with itself about what the highest order should be, even when the arguing is painful, even when it leads to destruction, that species never finishes adapting. He paused. Because it never believes the question is finished. There was a very long silence. He watched the Queen's exoskeleton. The indigo was doing something he had never observed. It was shifting, slowly, barely perceptibly, toward a color at the edge of the spectrum he could see. Not quite violet, not quite blue, something deeper, richer, as if the question itself had changed the chemistry beneath her skin. "You are saying," she said, with a precision that told him she had followed every word, "that your disorder is a strength." "I'm saying," he replied, "that what looks like disorder from outside might look like resilience from inside." He did not push further. He had learned, from behavioral ecology, from xenobiology, from 6 weeks of watching the most powerful individual on this planet think, that the most dangerous thing you could do with an idea was oversell it. You planted it, and you waited, and you let the other mind do what minds do when they encounter something that doesn't fit their existing model of the world. You let them sit with the discomfort of it. Because discomfort, in minds capable of growth, was not a sign of rejection. It was the beginning of learning. The months that followed were not comfortable. He was not suddenly free, not suddenly treated as an equal, not suddenly safe. The Velkhara did not transform overnight. No civilization does, and to expect otherwise would have been not just naive but insulting, reducing a complex species to a simple reaction. What changed was more subtle and more durable. He was given access to the palace library, a vast, organized archive of Velkhara knowledge stored in both written and what he came to understand were recorded harmonic formats, complex arrangements of sound that carried information the way a book carries text. He was given a more formal language instruction, conducted by an elderly Velkhara academic of high rank who seemed to find his linguistic progress professionally interesting in a way that transcended whatever position he held in the social hierarchy. He was also quietly given tasks. Not labor, not what he'd feared in his first days. The tasks were intellectual. Analysis of survey data from Velkhara expeditions into systems they had not fully mapped. Cross-referencing of biological catalogs. Once, and this startled him deeply, an invitation to contribute to a formal assessment of atmospheric anomalies in the Velmuth region, the contested territory he had heard mentioned in his first throne room visit. He spent 4 days on that analysis, pulling everything he knew about atmospheric chemistry, stellar radiation effects, and planetary science, cross-referencing it with the Velkhara data he had been given, and produced a report in imperfect but functional written Velkhara that identified 3 variables the Velkhara analysts had not yet considered. 2 of the 3 turned out to be significant. He did not know this for 3 weeks. Then the elderly academic appeared at his chamber door and said, without ceremony or warmth, but with a kind of deliberate precision that he had come to recognize as the Velkhara equivalent of respect, "Your 3rd variable was incorrect. Your first 2 were not," and left. He spent the rest of that evening sitting by his amber window watching the Vethner pass overhead and feeling something complicated. Not triumph, that felt wrong, felt too simple. Something more like the feeling he used to get when a species he had been observing for weeks finally revealed a behavior he hadn't predicted. The feeling of the universe being slightly larger and stranger than you'd thought. He was learning Velkhara science, and somewhere, he suspected, some of them were learning something else. The crisis arrived in the 9th month, and it arrived without warning in the way that crises always do, not suddenly, but all at once after having been building for longer than anyone had noticed. The Orath attacked Velmuth. He knew it had happened before anyone told him because of the chromatophores. He was in the library when the shift moved through the palace, every Velkhara in the room simultaneously going from their varied colors to a deep, pulsing red. A red so saturated it was almost biological, like watching a wound open. He had never seen a collective chromatophoric response before. It was, briefly, the most alien thing he had witnessed since arriving, more than the throne, more than the Vethner, more than any of it. This involuntary synchronization of biological emotion across an entire intelligent species in a shared space, every individual body broadcasting the same thing at the same moment. Fear and rage, in that order. He was escorted back to his chamber, and the door was locked for the first time in 3 months. He sat and waited and listened to the sounds of the palace shifting around him, rapid footsteps, command harmonics, the hum of what he had come to recognize as their communication arrays cycling up to high-output mode. The Orath, from what he had pieced together, were the Velkhara's oldest and most serious adversaries. Not because the Orath were militarily superior, the Velkhara's technology was more advanced by most measures, but because the Orath fought differently. They did not engage in the formal, hierarchically structured warfare the Velkhara favored. They were adaptive, asymmetric, unpredictable. They did not have a Vel. They organized around need rather than rank, and this made them nearly impossible for the Velkara command structure to model accurately. Every Velkara military projection Darian had been peripherally exposed to had underestimated the Orath by what he privately calculated as somewhere between 30 and 50%. He had not said anything about this. He had not been asked. 14 hours later, the door opened and a guard he recognized, not the young food delivery guard, but one of the Queen's personal attendants, a high-ranked individual whose exoskeleton was a deep bronze, entered and said, in clipped, formal Velkara, "The Queen requires your analysis." He stood. He straightened his clothes. He had been given Velkara garments weeks ago, simple and functional, dark fabric with a slight weight to it that reminded him of canvas. He walked the corridors of the palace he now knew well enough to map from memory, past the library and the formal court chambers, and the hall that led to the eastern atmospheric sensors he had helped recalibrate in the 7th month, and into the command center he had never been permitted to enter before. It was smaller than he expected, dense with technology, every surface active. 8 Velkara advisors stood around a central display, a 3-dimensional map of the Velmuth region, with tactical overlays he could read well enough by now to parse the situation. The Orath had pushed through 3 of the Velkara's defensive perimeters simultaneously. They were not advancing to occupy, they were moving. To cut off the supply lines to the northern Vethner breeding grounds. Why the breeding grounds mattered tactically was not immediately clear to him, but the anxiety in the room told him it mattered enormously. The Queen stood at the center of the display. Her exoskeleton was pure indigo, no shift, no fluctuation, controlled to a degree that was, he realized, not calm but the performance of calm, which was itself a form of leadership. She looked at him when he entered and said, "The Orath do not fight with order. You have told me that humans also have no singular order. Tell me how you fight." He looked at the map. He looked at the supply lines. He looked at the breeding ground positions and suddenly understood the Vethner, the aerial creatures he watched from his window. They weren't just ecologically significant. They were strategic. The Velkara used them. For what exactly he didn't know, transport, reconnaissance, something else, but the Orath clearly knew their value. "Humans fight," he said, "by making the cost of winning too high to pay." He asked for access to the tactical database. There was a moment of hesitation, the advisor's chromatophores flickering in several directions at once, a committee of biological uncertainty. Then the Queen said one word, and the access was given. He worked for 11 hours. He did not stop to sleep. He moved through the data the way he moved through alien ecosystems, looking not for the answer, but for the shape of the question, for what everyone else in the room had already agreed was true that might not be. He found 3 assumptions embedded in the Velkara tactical model that he suspected were wrong, and he found them because they were exactly the kind of assumptions that a deeply hierarchical species would make about an enemy that didn't organize hierarchically. The Velkara kept looking for the Orath command structure because they could not fully conceptualize an effective fighting force that didn't have one. They kept trying to find the head to cut off. There wasn't a head. There were just people making decisions at the point of need. He proposed not a counterattack, but a cost modification. Make the approach to the breeding grounds sufficiently resource-intensive that the Orath's need-based decision-making would recalculate the value of the objective. They weren't ideological. They wouldn't press a losing position for pride. But the Velkara had to stop trying to predict their movements and start trying to change their calculations. He explained this in his best Velkara, which was by now fluent enough that 2 of the advisors stopped looking skeptical and started looking at the display. It worked. Not perfectly, not without cost. 3 Velkara defensive stations were lost in the 4 days it took to implement, and the Orath extracted a price in materiel that the advisors seemed deeply distressed by. But the breeding grounds were protected, the supply lines stabilized, and the Orath retreated from Velmuth within the week, not because they were defeated, because the mathematics had shifted against them. Darian went back to his chamber and slept for 14 hours. When he woke, the door was unlocked. Not just unlocked, removed. The lock mechanism was simply gone, as if it had been taken off and set aside somewhere, as if whoever had done it hadn't wanted to make a ceremony of it but had simply made a decision and acted on it. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. He thought about what it meant to hold power over someone. He thought about the Velkara concept of Vel, of natural supremacy, and how it had produced a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and genuine grandeur, and also a civilization that had never developed the capacity to learn from something it had classified as beneath it. He thought about the Orath, who organized around need, and how that same quality that made them difficult to predict was also what kept them from dominating the Velkara entirely. Because without hierarchy, sustained campaigns of organized complexity became difficult to sustain. He thought about humans, his own messy, contradictory, self-defeating, stubborn, adaptive species, who had fought for thousands of years about what the highest order was and somehow never finished the argument. He thought about the elderly academic who had told him, without warmth but with precision, that 2 of his 3 variables were correct. He thought about the guard who righted the food block when it tipped sideways, because the center was right, even when it didn't matter, even when no one was watching except a prisoner who was supposed to be property. He got up. He walked to his window. The sky of Soveth Prime was teal and deep, and the Vethner were drifting through it with the slow, impossible grace of creatures that had found the exact frequency at which the universe would carry them. 2 days later, he was summoned to the throne room. Again. The room was the same. The floor, the ceiling, the columns of carved veined stone that absorbed all light. But the formation was different. The court was present, but arrayed in a looser configuration than before, less ceremonial, more gathered, more like a group of people in a room than a formal court in a throne room. He noticed this and noted it. He stood in the center and waited. The queen rose from her throne. He had never seen her stand while addressing him. She was very tall, and in the strange, absorbed light of the veined ceiling, she seemed to contain her own illumination, the indigo of her exoskeleton generating its own soft glow. She said in Velkara, formal register, but without the court address harmonics, direct, almost personal. "You were called Shevdal when you entered this palace." He said, "I know." She said, "That designation was the natural order as we understood it." He said, "I know." She said, "I am reconsidering what I understand of natural order." There was a silence that had texture to it, like the air before a storm. The court's chromatophores were in the warm amber he had finally fully catalogued. The color, he had come to understand, that meant something between wonder and recalculation, between being surprised and being changed. She said, "What do your people call someone who is one thing and becomes another?" He thought about that. He thought about every word he knew in the context of transformation. He thought about what his people called someone who endured what was meant to break them and simply continued, adapted, did not stop learning, did not stop being interested in the universe even when the universe was pressing down on them with an extra 1.1 gravities of weight. He said in English, and then translated carefully into Velkara, "We call them human." The queen looked at him for a long time. Her lateral eyes moved, processing, considering, going somewhere deeper than the surface of the moment. Then she said something he had not expected. She said it quietly, without harmonic emphasis, without court performance. She said it the way someone says a thing they have been arriving at for a long time and have only just reached the words for. She said, "What do you require to stay, to continue?" And there it was. Not an apology, he had not expected one, and would not have known what to do with it if offered. Not a declaration of equality, because that transformation was real but slow, and she was honest enough not to pretend it was complete. Just a question. A simple, direct, unprecedented question from someone who had held total power over him for 9 months and was now, openly, in front of her entire court, asking what he needed. He had thought about this. He had thought about it in the 11 hours of tactical work, in the months of library study, in the long amber evenings watching the Vethner. He had thought about what a person, a scientist, a human, someone from a species that had never stopped arguing about what the highest order was, actually needed to do their best work, to contribute genuinely, to be part of something rather than property within something. He said, "Contact with Earth. A means to communicate what I have learned here and what you are willing for them to know. A role defined by contribution rather than classification." And he paused, the last thing the most important, a window that opens. The Queen tilted her head again. That borrowed human gesture, made entirely her own. She said, "The first three are substantial, the last one is small." He said, "The last one is not small." She looked at him for one more long moment, and then she made a decision in the way that leaders who are genuinely great make decisions. Not because they have weighed every factor to the last decimal point, but because they have arrived at a moment where they understand something true, and truth has weight, and weight moves things. She said, "Granted." He did not feel triumph. He had stopped expecting triumph to be the thing he felt at moments like this. He felt, instead, the particular human sensation of having survived long enough to reach the place where the real work begins. The years that followed were the most complicated and the most important of his life. Contact with Earth was established, difficult, contested, subject to political pressures on both sides that he navigated with the same patience he had applied to everything on Soveth Prime. There were those on Earth who wanted to classify the Valkara as a threat, and those who wanted to classify them as an opportunity, and very few who wanted to classify them as what they were. A civilization in the early, uncomfortable stages of questioning its own foundations, which is both the most volatile and most hopeful thing a civilization can be. There were those in the Valkara court who wanted to classify Darian as an anomaly, one exceptional specimen of an otherwise unremarkable species, and use that classification to avoid examining what his existence in their palace actually meant about their assumptions. He had expected this. He had prepared for it. He let the elderly academic be the one to dismantle it, because the elderly academic had spent 9 months watching a Sheftel decode written Valkara in 6 weeks, contribute meaningfully to atmospheric science, and reframe a military crisis in 4 days, and had arrived at his own conclusions through his own process, which made them resistant to dismissal in a way that anything Darian said about himself never could be. The window in his chamber was replaced with one that opened. On the first morning he opened it, the air of Soveth Prime came in, heavier than Earth's, carrying that slight mineral charge of a planet with a stronger magnetic field, carrying the distant, bell-like resonance of the Vethner somewhere above, and he stood with his hands on the sill and let it wash over him and thought about the difference between a cage that is open and a space that is free, and how the distance between the two was not always as large as it seemed, and was sometimes as small as a hinge. He thought about Queen Savara Velkith, who had called him Shevtile and meant it, and had later said, "What do you require?" and meant that, and was now moving, slowly, imperfectly, with resistance from her court and questions she did not yet have answers to, toward a version of Vel that was not supremacy but something closer to stewardship. It was not a transformation. It was a beginning of one, and beginning was enough. He thought about the Orath, who he had not met but hoped, someday, too. He thought about what a meeting between 3 civilizations with 3 entirely different organizing principles might produce, and he thought it might produce something terrifying and extraordinary and worth being alive to see. He thought about Earth and its thousands of years of the same argument, and how that argument was not a failure but a process, a continuous refinement of an unanswerable question that nevertheless produced, through the friction of its pursuit, the most adaptive species the galaxy had so far managed to produce. He thought about pattern recognition. He thought about how the human brain, pressed into a dark cell with nothing but the sounds of a foreign language through a wall, will begin to find the pattern anyway. Not because it is trying to survive, exactly, though that too, but because that is what it is. What it was built to be, over hundreds of thousands of years of needing to understand new environments faster than the environment could kill them. The Vethner passed above, vast and slow and free, and their bell-tone resonance came through the open window and moved through the room and through him, and he exhaled, and the morning of Soveth Prime went on. He was still, technically, on a planet he had not chosen to come to. He was still navigating a civilization that did not fully understand him and was only beginning to try. He was still the only human for several light years in any direction, with imperfect communication links and an uncertain future and more questions than he had had when he arrived. But the window was open. And for a human, for a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and the worst of themselves and the best of themselves and every permutation in between, that had never once, in 300,000 years, stopped asking what the right order of things was, an open window was not a small thing. It was the whole thing. It was everything,